Our world is changing. We've been 5 years ago, we wouldn't have put heat pumps in anything. Now heat pumps are really prevalent in low load homes. And now they're talking about moving to CO2 systems, right? Because of refrigerant loss and charges and that environmental impact.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, our regular discussion with building industry professionals. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by architect Emily Mottram of Mottram Architecture in Cumberland, Maine, and host of the BS and Beer Show and the E3 podcast. This is the second segment of our two-part interview. You can find the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. What are the challenges of being a woman architect in such a male-dominated, slow-to-change industry? The architect-builder relationship is often somewhat adversarial to begin with. Is it worse for women? And what can home building do to make itself more inclusive? And I'll let you take whatever component of that question you want to first.
Yeah. One, I think that I am lucky in a lot of respects because, as I mentioned, I grew up in a farming community, and when you're a farm community, it doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, everybody works, right?
Yeah.
And so I had kind of a different upbringing, right? My dad only had daughters, and that didn't make any difference to him, right? And so I think I had a really good kind of background that said, it doesn't matter if this seems more challenging. Now, then at the same part, when I decided to start my own business, I met with a small business administration person. Like, I didn't know a lot about business. I don't think a lot of architects are not taught business in school, right? Even though like 50% of us go into business for ourselves, right? So it should be things we should be taught. But he said, you're young, you're female, and no one's going to talk to you. And I think I held on to that for a really long time. And so then I was afraid, and this goes back to training, I was afraid to be on job sites and ask people, because I'm like, I'm young, I'm female, and I'm asking people to do things building science related that they're already going, this isn't how we've done this for 25 years. And so it was hard. And I don't know if that's young architect, right? Because the builder architect relationship is really tough. So to go on a job site with somebody who's twice your age, who's been doing it for 25 years, and for them to relate to you, you feel like, and I think this is pretty traditional for women, is you feel like you have to be perfect, right? So I have to feel like I already know, and I want to learn from you, and I know you have something valuable, but I have to find some way to relate to you so that you stop looking at me as like the young kid on the site. And so I even mentioned this, I think, a couple of weeks ago on one of the podcasts with Steve Basic. And he's a great example of, he's like, I'll climb up on the roof and I'll talk to the roofer, and they'll be like, who are you? And he's like, I'm the architect. And they're like, oh, And I said, I'm not going to climb up on the roof. One, because I don't like heights. But two, because I don't feel like for a lot of years that I was confident in that. And I said, as a female, I feel like I have to already, I have to feel like I already know. And so I've had a lot of male counterparts say like, oh yeah, I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk to them and find out what they're doing, because they're really proud of their craft and they willingly share that with you. And I don't know if it's a personal mindset or if it's an actual prejudice that's not the position that I'm going to take when I go onto a job site. Now that I've been doing it a lot longer, and I work with builders that I really know, like, and trust, I absolutely all day I'm going to go up there and be like, okay, how'd this work? How do I get better? What didn't go well? Like, oh, you're doing this differently. Okay, explain this to me. And so I don't know if that's more experience or just that I've gotten to the point where I recommend that clients work with contractors that I know, like, and trust, and that I bring them on during the design phase, and that we've created an integrated team, and that it's a very comfortable environment for me with people who just know me as Emily, right? It doesn't matter whether I'm a female in the field. And so, um, although for a while, I have a female builder that I work with a lot, and I always said it was kind of a pleasure to work with her because nothing was ever an issue. There was never any blame, right? We have an issue. How do we solve it? And that was the response there. And so that was really great on how to make things. It's an attitude thing, I think. So
What can men do to make the industry more inclusive for people who are different than them? You know, this is a very white, male-dominated industry. What can we do to make it less so?
yeah, honestly, I think the best people that I just really love working with over and over again decide to come on board on the team, whether it's on site or not, and they're like, okay, I haven't done it that way, but I'm willing to try. Explain it to me. And they're very, very open-minded, right? And so when you see that and you get that from a person and their crew and the subcontractors that they work with from the very beginning, it changes the whole dynamic. And so I think, the what can happen is, getting together early on in the process and everybody being like, we all have something valuable to add here. What are we all bringing to the table? Just kind of, I don't know. Let's go of the ego in building, right? And whether that's perceived or on purpose, like nobody wants to be wrong, right?
Right.
But at the same time, none of us learn if we don't know when we are wrong. And so I think the people that I've really gravitated to, that I really enjoy working with, and there are a lot of obviously men, right, are just really open minded. And they're like, okay, team, what's the goal here? What's the bigger picture than what we're building? What are we trying to achieve? I'm working on a project where the owner has a pretty severe chemical sensitivity. And we had to figure out how to take petroleum out of almost everything in the building, which is nearly
Mm.
impossible, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's plastic in
Everything.
everything. So, but the homeowner shows up on the job site and she's like, this is why we're doing it, right? And she keeps repeating, this is why we're doing it, till all the trades, all the subcontractors. And that builder was like, yeah, absolutely, all day long. I get it. We'll work with different things. We'll think about every material we bring in here. We'll use board sheathing and board flooring, and we'll eliminate plywood in the structure, and we'll do. And so it was everybody on the team from the very beginning was just involved in what the overarching goal was to achieve in that structure. And that made everybody really comfortable.
That's cool. I think that's all too infrequent, right?
Right.
So, who are your favorite architects and designers? Do you have a top 10 list or a top 5 list of your favorite architects
Oh, wow.
besides Steve?
Besides Steve, yeah, I'm a huge fan of Steve and what
Me
he
too.
brings to the table, and Christine Williamson as well, and her, you said about architects and educating, and I mean, just her Instagram posts, you can learn something every time. It's like, oh yeah, okay, that is why I do that, which is brilliant. For architects, so they're both two big players in the field of architecture in the residential world in building science right now. But then I love some of the old masters, and of course, like you go back to Ando, and it was a lot of concrete, and we're going, oh my god, we should use less concrete now. But or Mies van der Rohe, and like everything should be simple, right? Simple and classic. But in architecture school, my favorite architect was Bernard Maybeck, which a lot of people didn't necessarily know, and it was more castles, and I mean, not castles per se, but it was very detailed and fussy things. But I said the other day, I think on the podcast to Travis, it's a good day in my world when somebody else knows an architect other than Frank Lloyd Wright, and not that he didn't bring something to the table for sure. But he's like, that's the person that everybody seems to know. And there are so many brilliant architects out there who have done really cool things. So I don't really have a top list because I think there's something to learn from everywhere. And my husband and I love to travel. Pre-pandemic, we've
Do
been
you go to architectural sites when you travel?
well. When I was in architecture school, I studied in Rome, so I spent a semester in Rome and traveled all over Italy, which is another one of those weird environmental things, right? They don't tear the United States and Japan. We have a tendency to tear things down a lot, right, and then build different things. You go to Rome, and I mean, it's been there
For
forever.
centuries.
You know? And that wooden door might be 500 years old, and we're like, "Oh, man, we're replacing wooden doors every 20 years because they fail or whatever." But no, they just maintain them, right? So there's this thing to longevity and maintenance and, you know, they knew to face their buildings south, right? When they had stones and, no windows. And so there's something to learn from every place that you've traveled and culture, and I think that's a more rewarding experience.
What are
So,
some of the coolest places you've been?
so my favorite place is Costa Rica because 95% of their power is made by renewable energy. They have this very chill, like pura vida way of life, and
And a great
they
climate, come on.
it's a great climate. And if you order a Coke, you get it in a bottle, and you might not be able to read the label anymore because instead of crunching it up and recycling it and making a new bottle, they just put more Coke in the Coke bottle. And to me, that seems like kind of an obvious thing, right? They sterilize it and they put the same thing in the same
Well, we
bottle.
did that until pretty recently. I
I
don't
know.
understand what happened,
I
right?
don't know either. So that's one of my favorite places to travel. My husband and I are both divers, and so understanding the ocean and the ocean environment and what we're doing to our oceans too, and then going warm places like Costa Rica is
So how
just
does a farm girl get introduced to diving?
um so my parents actually love to travel, and when I was a kid, they always made sure they took us somewhere. When I was really young, and we went camping a lot. Camping, outdoorsy stuff. Did a lot of that. But till I got older, my dad doesn't own the farm. He's a dairy farmer. He doesn't own the farm. Um, but till I got older, they wanted to expand their travel base and they took us places. And so I knew when I graduated from high school that part of the reason why I went to Penn State was I knew I wanted to study abroad. I knew that was what I wanted to do. And so then when I met my husband at Penn State, and then we started to travel together, and he's like, "Hey, when I was in college, I took this scuba diving class. It's really cool." And so I was like, okay. So one year for Christmas, he got me the course and we went and I learned how to dive. And ever since then, I'm like, this is the best. I mean, when I was a kid, we always went to the beach and to the ocean. So I've always been a water person. So it was pretty natural to then kind of move into diving and the underworld environment of the ocean.
On an unrelated question, dairy farming is a tough business, and the cows need milked whether you're there or not. How does a dairy farmer take his kids on vacation for a week? That's a hard thing to do, right?
Right. So I think that's part of so we could have a whole long discussion about our world and where our food comes from and the disconnect, but a lot of and especially I think dairy farming, but a lot of farming, small farms just don't really exist anymore. They're all bigger farm conglomerates in order to actually meet the demands of what is being. I actually think it costs more to produce a gallon of milk than it does to buy one, right? So there's all this whole it's a really tough industry. But part of that was my dad does not own the farm, right? So he works 15 hours a day and he has every other weekend off, right?
Mm.
So cows have to be milked and they have to they
They have to
that
be fed, and
they have to be
yeah,
fed.
yeah.
There's all kinds of other things that goes into, what you have to do on the farm. So there are multiples of my dad, right? So he's not the only herdsman, and that's sort of how you get to take your because in other farming trades or whatever, you'd have to wait for like an off season. So if you're growing something, then in the winter time when you're doing all of your repairs and your other stuff, you might have some time to go and do something else. But generally, you need a couple of people to make it work, no matter how big your farm is. So
Oh
uh,
yeah.
that was,
Lived in Vermont for a while, and I know it's a tough business.
yeah.
Can you tell me about your E3 podcast? What do you talk about there, and how did that get started, and how do folks listen?
Sure. So I used to write a lot of blogs, right? Because I think that I like once I know information, I like other people to know information. I had to put this out there, and so for a while, I wrote a blog. But then, as we kind of keep moving, I hear that people don't they don't read as much anymore, which is kind of sad because I'm a big reader. I love books, but so podcasts are becoming these things people can listen to them, while they're working or on pre-pandemic on their commute, which is where a lot of people took that in.
Mhm.
And so I started the podcast as sort of the next level of the blog to continue the discussion about energy efficiency and, products and things. I mean, our world is changing. We've been 5 years ago, we wouldn't have put heat pumps in anything. Now heat pumps are really prevalent in low load homes. And now they're talking about moving to CO2 systems, right? Because of refrigerant loss and charges and, that environmental impact. And so things just change so fast. And so I try to keep up with that. And then so I would talk about a bunch of things. I talked about architecture, because I think most people don't actually know what architects do. And I talk about, being a female entrepreneur, right? So that's especially in a male dominated industry. And so then I like to highlight the other women in the industry because they're out there. And, if there's somebody that can be an inspiration to you, maybe more women will join. So I like to highlight them. And then building science. And so I've had everybody, all the guests that come on have something to give to add to the discussion, and I learn, right. This is great continuing education every week because there's somebody on, I'm going to learn something. um,
And
you can listen.
is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it when you get a chance?
It is supposed to be weekly.
Hmm.
Obviously, we're almost at the end of the year. I've released 43 episodes this year. So, with holidays, things that have happened, whatever, if for the most part, they come out on Fridays. Except for this week's, which came out on Monday after taking 2 weeks off. for
Right.
Thanksgiving. But it's 2020, it's the end of the year, everybody's busy, and I've actually had a couple of people say, like, "We love your podcast, but, weekly makes it kinda hard, especially if there's if they're an hour long or whatever, and you're not in your car for an hour because nobody's commuting anywhere, so carving out the time to listen every week doesn't always happen for people. So, but supposed to be weekly on Fridays.
And how can folks listen?
You can listen to it on my website, so on mottраmark.com. You can listen on Spotify, Stitcher, or iTunes.
Cool.
So
Brings me to my favorite question. So, can you tell me about your own house, and do you have any lingering building science problems that you're ignoring happily or unhappily,
so
or
this
any
is
other problems for that matter? I guess.
This is a joke that I like to say all the time, which is people are always like, "Oh, I want to see the architect's house," and I'm like, "No, you don't. The architect's house is always the experiment. This is where we try all the things that we put in your house after we've tried them, and we make sure that it works, right?" Um, and so I own an existing house. One, because I wanted to live on the water in Maine. So we live on an estuary in Maine, and I don't want to make it worse, right? So I don't want to add to the pollutants of what's already there. So we bought an existing house. We also moved here in December. So, building a house and waiting, like it wasn't going to be possible. So we bought an existing house. I have a atmospherically drafting oil boiler. I have a gas range, which needs to go. I have a 1977 house that was all electric at one point that they ripped out. And so all the electrical wiring is still in the box. I didn't take any of it out. which we found out when we wired for the electric car that I just bought. So I do have a heat pump hot water tank, which was the first thing I did, because anybody who lives in Maine or anywhere where you have an oil boiler, there's nothing more frustrating than hearing your oil boiler kick on in August to make hot water
To
for
make a gallon of
nobody.
hot water, right?
No one is going to take a shower in the next like 12 hours, but it kicks on because it's got to keep that 5 gallons hot. And so that was the very first thing I did. I'm like, okay, the boiler can't make hot water. This is the most inefficient way to deal with this. We need to come up with another solution. But so the flow of this house is really great, and I was like, I can work with this. And I joked, I was like, I only want to change a couple of things, and my husband says, no, you want to change literally everything. I'm like, well, not really. but but yeah, so there's probably not a lot that you could do that would be more efficient than starting with an existing structure, right?
I agree.
Something that's already here. But at the same time, this goes back to the pretty good house, and why the pretty good house works for renovations too is there'll be a tipping point at which it doesn't make sense for me to do any more with efficiency here because I'm putting too much carbon back into the building to offset something that you would never do with a new construction, but because you've inherited it, um, you you have it and it's already got its carbon footprint, right? And so then where does it go? You don't want to add all of this stuff to the landfill just to put in something new, which has a new carbon impact, and then find out that it would have been better environmentally for you to kind of stick with something that.
So just buy some more heating oil for, another 10 years or whatever, right?
Right. I mean, my oil boiler is from 91, I think. It's not going to last forever. And um, if you've listened to the podcast, I think my husband was ready to kill me this summer because I just shut it off. I was like, and it wasn't a cold start boiler. And I was like, I don't care if it doesn't turn back on, right? It's from the 90s. It's not at its end of life. It still runs, but we were able to cold start it and turn it back on. And it's perfectly fine. So it's a workhorse and it's going to stick with us for a little bit longer till we can get to the point where we knew when we came into this house, the building inspector said the roof was going to need to be replaced in 5 years. And so when we replace the roof in 5 years, and I won't put solar panels on until we replace the roof because I don't want to take them all off and then, put them. So the way that we make power and where our electricity is from and everything, we want to just make sure that we're making the right decisions, because if you build an all electric house and then your power is coming from a coal fired power plant, then you're not really doing better. Right. So too many things to think about, but yeah, I have
What is Maine's energy mix? Where are you guys getting most of your power?
Um, it used to be a lot of hydro.
Coming
80%
from
of
Quebec?
80% of Maine's power was coming from Quebec Hydro, and then there was this whole thing with the pipeline, and now not all of it comes from there, and we're actually doing worse than we were, but the Maine Climate Council is working on putting into action a plan to move towards all renewable resources. We have some offshore wind, and there are downsides to hydro and offshore wind too. And the solar industry, for a couple of years, our governor, not our current governor, but the past one, was really against helping the solar industry. And so we saw varying degrees of solar go down, and then they kind of reversed that. And so now solar is going back up, and I think more people are doing that. The offset to the pipeline was supposed to be several megawatt fields of solar power to pick up peak demand. So there's just, I don't know where all of it comes from right now, but they're working towards getting back to more renewable energy, and more people are asking for that. So,
do you guys work on the house yourself ever? Is that something you enjoy doing, or would you rather pay someone to work on it?
It depends on what it is.
Mm-hmm.
We do some work ourselves, just because, it's.
You have to, I suspect.
Yeah, you have an existing house. You got to do some stuff. And, both my husband and I are fairly handy. So it's kind of a joke that we don't do projects well together. But we do some work ourselves, but then, in the same respect that I respect, people respect me for being an architect and what I bring to the table, I definitely respect other people and what they bring to the table, electrical, plumbing, sheetrock. I mean, we can lay a wood floor, right? But not a single wall in our house is straight. So, so there are some things that we can do and have done. I grew up, my grandfather was a contractor and a full wood shop. So we've got a bunch of woodworking tools and we'll do some things that we like to, but, even my sister's husband is a professional house painter. And so when they came to visit two summers ago when we first moved in here, I was like, "Can you paint my kitchen? I mean, this is gonna take me like 2 weeks to do." And he was done in like an hour and a half. So yeah. So I
I have
actually
to invite people here on vacation and then get them to do my projects. How do you do
yeah,
that?
it works great. Beer and, feeding them and yeah, so I definitely have no problem paying people to do it, but as you can tell right now in our current environment, finding somebody who can do something is tough, and that is one thing in our industry that I think is really lacking is there are a lot less people doing smaller renovation type projects, like a small scale project than, a contractor wants to come and do the whole, like a whole bigger project. And so finding the smaller guys is hard because those guys are all really busy.
Yeah. Emily, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I really mean it. Is there anything you want to tell our audience or ask them?
Um, no, tune into the BS and Beer show on Thursday nights. Honestly, I take very, very little credit for making that happen. That was a discussion between Mike and I when our group couldn't meet anymore, and bringing Travis on, it's been an extremely rewarding experience. People can watch the replays on YouTube on the BS and Beer Show's YouTube channel. So if you've missed out joining us live, I know it doesn't work for everybody to tune in on Thursday evenings at 6 o'clock Eastern time. It's kind of a rough time for the West Coast. Um,
And it's dinner time for a lot of folk too.
Yeah, and so it's kind of a rough time, but if you get too late on the East Coast to make it work on the way, so it's kind of crazy. We typically have anywhere from 100 to 200 people who join us live on the show on Thursday nights, which is fun. You can watch the replays and the discussion from the replay and the presentations from our guests is really rewarding. But I do encourage people, if you can or you have the opportunity to join in live, what you don't get on the replay is the chat box. And there's a very lively chat on Thursday nights from people who are also experts in the field who might not be on the show, who share links to lots of other valuable webinars or places to get certain products when we talk about product type stuff. And then just a discussion in the chat box. People have questions about the subject. And so it's really entertaining to also join live. So encourage people, it's free. Not always the most convenient time, but it's free. Uh, and so, and so if you miss it, or there's a subject that you just don't know anything about, there's been like 9 or 10 months now of shows every Thursday, except for on holidays. So lots of great stuff to catch up on, and to connect with the people in our industry who are making a difference. So
I really enjoyed hearing from Ross Trethui. Was it 2 weeks ago? And his very practical take on, how do we move to a better energy mix for our homes, but the practical considerations with regard to that was very interesting to hear someone who had clearly thought a lot about that and is dealing with market forces to try and get people to do better things. But oftentimes market forces prevent folks from making a switch, right?
yeah, I think market forces is the biggest issue in the construction industry. Is generally you have this big market who's pushing for something, right? And a lot of times they're pushing for something which might be a product or whatever that is backed by people who have a lot more money than us in the building science community,
Yep.
right? And so it can be really hard to overcome some of that stuff. And so it's always fun to kind of hear these people like Ross talk about how they've thought about more than just, and how can they make an impact. And that's I think the BS and Beer show was sort of started as this way for connection, and it has, I think, morphed into other people sharing some of those things. Like, hey, these are some considerations. This is what we've done. So.
It's time well spent. I'm the first to recommend it. It is a good program, and I think you all do a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Once again, Emily, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you as well.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Emily Mottram for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Thanks for listening once again, folks. Stay safe and happy building.